Today I'm joined by former state senator Jeff Agenbroad. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Greg. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for coming. Tell us about your background.
We won't go clear back to the beginning, but I think it helps with perspective. My family, my ancestors came to Idaho in the early 1900s, and their task then was to finish Arrow Rock Dam and put in some canal systems. Over the years, they settled. I come from a cattle ranch and farming background. It goes back multiple generations. I'm an Idaho educated guy all the way through elementary school up through college. My formal education and big part of my career has been in finance. I did leave the state for some advanced finance degrees, went to Washington for that. The bulk of my career has been in banking, business banking specifically, where I was involved in the financing of farming operations, commercial real estate, commercial businesses, and so forth. In addition to that, I have owned and operated a handful of my own businesses with my wife's help. She's an accountant by profession. We've been very integrated and involved in the community. That's my day job. My night job has to do with being involved in the community. From an early age, it was instilled upon me to always give back more than you've taken from your community. I took that to heart and was involved for 3-4 decades, specifically in the Nampa community and beyond, volunteering my time, talent, and treasure to make it a better community. I've been involved in nearly every civic organization in the community, as well as other projects. I love what we have here in Idaho, what we have in Canyon County, what we have in Nampa, and I want to do my part to continue to make that better and certainly preserve and understand the foundation of what brought us to where we are today and move that forward for our kids and grandkids.
What are some things that you've accomplished while you were senator that you're most proud of?
I ended my Senate term as the chairman or co-chairman of JFAC, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. With my background and understanding of finances, I helped the state improve our credit rating. We now have a higher credit rating than the federal government, which is a head scratcher, but Idaho does, so we can be proud of that. I supported our transparency. We were named the most fiscally sound, transparent state in the nation. And those are things that just don't happen because I was there. I was part of that team, I guess, that got us into that position. While I was in the Senate, I served 3 terms or 6 years. I passed more bills than any other senator during that time frame. I passed 105 bills. Volume isn't necessarily a good measure of success, nor do I look at it that way. And admittedly, many of those bills were actually budget bills rather than other types of legislation. But I'm more proud of the percentage of passage that I had even than the number of bills. 99% of what I brought to the Senate floor passed. I only lost one bill, and that bill was passed the next session. That bill had to do with motorcycle profiling. I carried that the first year, and we weren't able to get that one across the finish line. The second year we were. In amongst that legislation, it was a mixture of gun rights, protecting shooting ranges. It was, again, the fiscal soundness of the state and maintaining what we needed to do to run a light hand of government. Probably one of the most consequential but quiet bills that I sponsored and passed was a bill that allows every state agency to waive a rule, and then there's criteria. And this came about, again, most of my bills are constituent driven. People came to me and said, this is a problem. This is a potential solution. We went down that path to figure out if it would work and then put it into legislation and brought it to the legislature. But this was a bill that we all understand one size doesn't fit all. And there are thousands of pages of rules in Idaho code, and not code, but actual rule that guide the different agencies in their daily work. We also understand that situations are different geographically. So if it has to do with transportation, what works in one area of the state may or may not work in another area of the state. So at the time, there were agencies that had more forward-thinking directors that could see that the constituent that was before them asking for approval that didn't match up with their rule had actually a better solution than the rule provided. And they would take that solution and justify it and actually bend or break the rule. We had some agencies said that's the rule and we're not even looking at it. I can see that it's better, but there's a process, a very expensive and long drawn out process to appeal this and go through that, that mechanism. I didn't think that was right for Idaho citizens. So we put into code that actually the director of every agency has the ability to assess the situation. There's criteria around this, so they can't just willy-nilly waive rules. But if they're presented with a better solution than the rule provides in the specific circumstance that this rule is being brought before them, they have the ability, without going through the appeals process, to waive that rule and accept the better solution. I think this has saved people lots of time, money, and headaches as they deal with state government. Those are a few things that I worked on.
So with a 99% pass rate of the bills that you're bringing, that says to me that you focus on consensus building, compromise, and working with people to get things over the finish line versus it being a hard line. It has to be this or it has to be that, which I think is admirable for a senator, especially when the Senate is particularly known for having a more professional decorum, let's say, than the House. Not that there's anything wrong with the House, but it just seemed like the rules of decorum were higher for the Senate. That being said, during your 3 terms, when did you start seeing, or did you start seeing a shift in how people were behaving, how bills were getting passed, and the influence of outside groups?
Greg, I first of all probably ought to also set the stage that I never aspired to be in politics and certainly in state government. I've always been a lifelong Republican, contributed to a few campaigns. I actually never really got involved in any campaigns beyond contribution and supported people I thought would do a good job. I'm a pragmatic person, not a political person. I look for problems within my realm to solve, work to solve those and get them solved. Don't stand around and celebrate. I mean, certainly there's a time for celebrating, but move on to the next problem. That's the way I've always approached my career and life in general. While I was in office from day one, that's really the same way that I approached it, not from a political standpoint. In fact, there's a lot of things I like about or don't like about the politics, certainly today's environment and the nastiness and blood sport that it's really become. I think setting the stage there gives maybe the listener kind of a background of my approach to politics. I never intended actually even to get into politics. I was recruited by people in my community for about 5 years before I finally said, yes, I would run for office. And that request was made again the day before the filing day when I was told that my senator representing us and did a good job for us was going to be stepping out of the race and running for a Supreme Court justice position. And they needed somebody that they could was a known commodity and somebody that would represent the community to step in. So after consulting my wife, family, and friends for about 3 hours, I threw my name into the hat that first time that I ran and was put into office. When I got to the legislature, I found that there was a lot of legislators that were either appointed or came in a similar manner to mine. They were active in their communities, proven quantities in their leadership in their communities, never aspired to actually serve, certainly in state government, but there was a need there and they accepted that calling. Once they took that position, they could see the difference they could make. And so they continued to run and continue to make the difference that their community was asking of them.
Well, I appreciate that background because your story aligns with so many other legislators in Idaho who've been around a long time, especially those who have been in the state their whole lives or, been here multi-generations. And we're seeing this influx of a lot of people moving, and especially around the time of COVID and before, this big push of people moving from California, Oregon, Washington to Idaho because they saw it as a more conservative place to be. And then oftentimes we saw a lot of new candidates running that had just moved here, decided that they want to change Idaho to be more like what they wanted California to be. And then, try to instill those values upon the people who are already here. So, in your time, going back to the previous question, your time as a state senator, what did you see? What was your experience with how bills are getting passed and the influence of any outside groups, if any?
Well, I think it went from the time when my first session, I was elected in 2016, and my first session was 2017. And I was certainly a naive, wet behind the ears politician. I, again, prefer not to call myself a politician. So I didn't have a lot of expectations. I was going in to be a sponge, uh, understand the environment, the rules of the game, and then I could be effective. That was really what I spent at least the first part of my first term in office, started to pick that up and wanted to make a difference. I was probably oblivious to some of the outside forces at that point because I was sponging. I actually took a heavy load as a freshman. I served on three very onerous committees: JFAC, Health and Welfare, and Judiciary and Rules. So I was spending, 8, 9 hours a day in actually committee meetings and floor sessions. So didn't have a lot of time to interact during the day. I still held my full-time job as a banker. It was a very busy time, and again, probably didn't see things early on. Where I really started seeing things change, COVID certainly changed all of us. I can't imagine that there's a single person that it hasn't changed in some way. Maybe it's our thinking. When you look at we call them the cows, the California, Oregon, and Washingtons, as well as many other states that came into Idaho, it changed their residents. So there are just a lot of changes that were made. And there was some struggles that we went through, during the pandemic legislatively. I would have liked to have seen a special session that first year of the pandemic as we were receiving federal dollars to help, the legislature have a voice in how that money was to be spent. My wishes were not accepted and didn't come to reality. But so we come back in 21. I really saw the first blatant concerted efforts that were more about tearing people in the positions down than I'd seen before. I will say from probably 2020. So again, I went into 17. By the 2020 session, an organization that I supported when I went into office and for a few years, including financially, which was the Idaho Freedom Foundation. But by about 2020, I could see they were manipulating scores, and they were the only lobbying group that would come to me as a legislator. And instead of trying to tell me the benefits of their legislation, they told me the consequences if I didn't support it. That was the only group that did that at that time. So I didn't, even though I had supported the group and agreed with a lot of positions, maybe not the process, but the positions that they took, I could see that that was starting to drive the beast. I distanced myself from them. I severed my contribution ties to them. And quite honestly, they unfortunately became an adversary. So in early 2022, we were in the midst of post-pandemic. We had a big $1 billion worth of federal money that we didn't ask for. The feds didn't call us and say, "Do you need any money?" They just sent it to us, and they sent it to us before 2022, but we were still dealing with that in 2022. And so we're in the midst of, okay, what do we do with this? The question always came up. We don't have to accept that the federal government is flailing in debt, and there's no question about it. A big concern of mine was and still is. The option to send it back, it wasn't possible. Well, I shouldn't say it wasn't possible. We asked the question repeatedly, and Senator Risch gave us probably the consistent answer that we had been getting. He said, "You can send it back, but it will be just redistributed to the other states that want more money. So you're going to pay for it as Idaho taxpayers, paying your federal taxes, but you're not going to get any benefit from it. So why in the world would you ever consider sending it back? And consequently, we didn't. I mean, it would have been foolish because the federal government was not coming back to us and telling us that they would reduce our federal tax rate because we didn't take the money. Again, we were going to pay for it whether we took it or not. So Idaho needed to benefit from it. But the Freedom Foundation approached me during that session and asked me why I was not supporting more of their bills, and pointing out that my score wasn't what they thought it should be. And I told them that I would certainly support every one of their bills that benefit my constituents. My constituents are the ones who put me in office, and I would vote against every one of their bills that did not benefit my constituents. And that wasn't going to change. That's the way it had been from the beginning, and that wasn't going to change. Shortly thereafter, probably within a couple of weeks, maybe even less than a couple of weeks, the first, and this would have been in February of 22, the first nasty text went out from the Freedom Foundation to my entire district, telling them how much of a CRT loving, America hating guy I was. And and in addition to that, they attached, you can click on this link, give us your name and information, and we'll send your message to Senator Agenbroad, telling him how rotten he really is. I received, a lot of those emails, a lot, 50 of them probably, with the first round. I responded to every single one of them. And they thanked me for responding. They were surprised that they had fallen victim to this. They said they were, certainly supportive of my work. Unfortunately, many didn't drop me a note, so I couldn't respond to them. So they were continuing to believe the stuff that was being fed to them. And that ended up being several attacks. Now, I really wasn't in a position to respond, take a lot of time to respond, because we're trying to get through our budgets, finish up the legislative session, and get out of there on behalf of the taxpayers. And so these attacks were happening. The Citizens Alliance joined into those attacks. And probably the most disappointing thing was my local Republican Party, who had been ambushed by more libertarian and John Birch philosophically driven people than actually the Republican values. And they were actively campaigning against me on the streets at the same time that Young Americans for Liberty had folks on the streets campaigning against me. In those early, I'll call them attack campaigns, there was never mention of an opponent. It was always, Jeff has changed. If you knew Jeff, he's changed. This is what Boise's done to him. He's a spendthrift. He spends all the money he can get his hands on. And, right down the line, the twisting and turning of a hint of truth into something that was elevating people's emotions. We all know that once emotions are elevated, logic goes out the window. That's just the way the brain works. At the same time, this was kind of a perfect storm in many ways. At the same time, we were also redistricting. It took them a little while to get done. It wasn't until just before the filing dates we knew what our new districts would look like. About half of my district changed geographically and by people. On top of that, at least in Nampa, Idaho, in my new district, 2/3 of the people had not lived in Nampa any longer than 5 years. So they didn't know people. They didn't know place. Wasn't not their fault, but that's just the facts. Running on any kind of name recognition, which I have name recognition in Nampa, being here in my family so long, love us or hate us, you at least recognize the name. But any name recognition that I would have run on was really, for the most part, gone. And people didn't have any history of a place or people. They were absorbing any of the negative stuff that was being put out there. So I set up a kind of a really the perfect environment to unseat people that were targeted because of the environment.
So for listeners who have not heard this, I'm sure by now most people have. Let me explain. The Idaho Freedom Foundation, of course, is a 501c3 education charity, supposedly, that focuses on lobbying and messaging, supposedly educating people on what they would call conservative, but they were really a libertarian group. They created what they call the Freedom Score, a system of scoring bills based on their own cherry pick criteria and then cherry pick which of those 14 points they would use to then score a bill. Jeff, as you and I have seen, I think I've gone through multiple times on Political Potatoes and shown how when you apply their own freedom score correctly, the score is not the same as what it should is what they actually give out because they constantly change, as you said. One tactic I've noticed is this idea of them already saying, here's the legislation we want to run this year. Whether it's good or bad, it doesn't matter. We just want to get our opponents, the people we've already handpicked to target, to take out in the next election, having them on the record voting for or against a bill in a way that we can show that they have a negative score. Did you see any of that going on?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In the 2022 session on the Senate floor, it had been happening in the House, but not in the Senate. It has to do with the grocery tax bill. Now, give you a little background to where I fell on the grocery tax. In the 2017 session, the Senate actually, we call it radiator capping. We take a bill that was approved by the House. We essentially, and the House can do this to the Senate bill as well. We essentially keep the title and you can change everything about that bill. And we had taken an income, or I can't it was a tax bill. I don't recall if it was income tax, sales tax, but we took that bill, radiator capped it, and made it a grocery tax bill, repealing the grocery tax bill. At the time, I was a co-sponsor of that radiator capped bill. We passed that through the Senate. We passed it through the House, and it was vetoed by then Governor Otter. And the veto override that was attempted was not successful. So the grocery tax was still in place. I was a co-sponsor of that original bill and supported it. Fast forward to 2022. By now, in 2022, we had raised the grocery tax credit. So actually passing a grocery tax bill would have taken money out of some Idahoans' taxpayer pockets. It would have foregone some revenues from people from out of state that don't get that rebate, but use our services. So it would have eliminated that. But most importantly, I'm a free market guy. And I know the grocery industry operates on thin margins. To be successful in those thin margins, you have to understand your customer, and they understand their customer very well. They understand how much money they walked into the grocery store with, and they want to capture as much of that as they can. That's just good business. Nothing against that. That's just good business. I am not convinced then nor today am I convinced that a elimination of the 6% grocery tax will not result in an increase in the margin of the grocery stores. Because the price of groceries, I don't do most of the regular shopping in my household, but I can tell you the person that does probably isn't going to be able to tell you what they paid for that loaf of bread last week. Or whether it went up or whether it down. Now, if they started, I mean, they're certainly capable of that, but they don't watch things that close. Now, that's not true of everybody, but groceries, the price of groceries probably changes more than any other consumable out there. It would be my guess. So I think the grocery tax, I believe repealing the grocery tax would essentially take that 6% sales tax off at the register. I think you'd still walk out with the same bill at the end of the day from that register. But the downside is you would not get any of that money back at the end of the year if you repealed the grocery tax. So it is kind of a savings account and maybe puts a little pressure on the grocery industry to keep their prices reasonable.
It's interesting you bring up that point about the grocery tax because I see groups like the Idaho Freedom Foundation and their partners at Young Americans for Liberty, American Action Fund, whatever it's called, they all appear to operate as one group with no daylight between them. They've continued to hammer on the one thing: repeal the grocery tax, because it's a narrative they can explain easily because it's so nuanced, right? It's a, oh, well, why should you pay tax on groceries? Well, yeah, when you put it that way, that makes sense. But then when you understand that, okay, really it's a tax to that tourists, which Idaho relies a lot on tourism, the tourists end up paying because Owens get a rebate or a refund on the taxes they paid, but the tourists do not. So then it creates a revenue stream from people out of state coming here, using our parks, our recreational things, our national parks, state parks, and benefit from our beautiful state. They're here buying things, and their tax dollars stay here. That makes sense when you understand it. But it's easy to say, well, why should you pay tax on groceries? So finding a narrative that you can easily repeat and then say, well, you're a bad guy if you don't do this, right? You're horrible for wanting this. You're horrible if you want a pay raise. So it's all about having a strict narrative, and you just repeat over and over again, which is what we're seeing, which we saw done to you. You bring up an interesting point. It reminds me of what we saw with the school choice bill, which was House Bill 93 this last year, which pulled $50 million of taxpayer money to be handed out to parents as tax credits that are refundable. That they would get as checks to them to offset private school tuition. And many of these private schools were religious based. One of the arguments, and it's a fair point we're going to see next year, is many of these private schools, when they see parents who already were able to afford this, right? They were already spending the money on tuition, now having extra money in their pocket, what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to raise their tuition. Just like you said with the grocery tax, if you take the grocery tax away, you're already used to paying that same amount of money. Why would you change the price? You just keep it the same. And now you don't get that rebate, to your point. So why wouldn't grocery stores just keep that same dollar amount that you're already used to paying? And like I said, it's the same thing with the private school tuition. It's the free market at work, but it doesn't always work to our benefit. Really appreciate you bringing up that point. You mentioned the Idaho Freedom Foundation sending out these texts. In reality, they'll say it wasn't us. It was the Idaho Freedom PAC, which is, for those who don't know, is the difference between a 501c3 nonprofit and a political action committee. They do have to operate by different rules. Political action committee can do things like campaign and send out text messages for or against the candidate, and they have to report that. The nonprofit can't engage in that kind of campaigning. So they use their PAC. They were running out of the same office. Essentially, they had shared staff. It was the same people using the same things. Really, the only difference between Idaho Freedom Foundation and Idaho Freedom PAC was a sheet of paper. That's just the rules of how those things work. When you'd see these attacks coming at you from these text messages, emails, etc., in my experience looking at this, it felt like this was all staged. It was already planned ahead. Like they were prepping for a candidate they already had in the wings. They didn't want to introduce them till the last minute to ambush you, right? And so after your third term, tell me about that fourth campaign.
Well, that campaign, like I say, we started getting the attacks in February. I actually reached out because Wayne Hoffman was the president at that time. Wayne and I knew each other because we both lived in Nampa, didn't know each other well. I believe it went both ways. I certainly respected his position. I didn't always agree with his. When I first met Wayne, the Freedom Foundation, in their title, called themselves a libertarian think tank. And they were actually born by a couple of very strong libertarians, very strong, proud libertarians, both gentlemen that I respected. We didn't always agree politically. I'm a Republican and they were libertarians. When I believe they changed from that libertarian, they didn't change from the libertarian philosophy, but if you look at the percentage of registered libertarians in Idaho, it's among the smaller of the four registered parties, and then unaffiliated making a fifth group of people. I think constitutional are just a notch below as far as numbers than the libertarians. Well, I would imagine that they sat down and said, well, we can't, with this few people, we can't win and have influence that we want, so we better bag that libertarian title and call ourselves conservative or Republican. I don't know that I've ever heard them call themselves Republican, but certainly conservative. I'm not sure what the definition of conservative is today. I've been both applauded and lambasted for being a conservative my entire life. That's when I knew what that definition was. But today I can't say that I really know what that definition was. I had conversations with Wayne. I said, Wayne, what are you doing? I have plenty of warts. You can attack, reality. You can attack me for mistakes I've made or positions I've taken different, but don't make this crap up. This just flat out lies. And basically my response, or the response that I got is, Jeff, we're looking to do something different. You don't realize, as the JFAC co-chair, the type of power and influence that you have. And if you're not going to support us, then we're going to find somebody that will. I ended the conversation with something like, well, friends like you, who needs enemies? And really, I should step back and talk about that Freedom Foundation and my relationship. Early on, Wayne and I met when I first was running and talked about where we could work together and our differences between the Republican and Libertarians. Wayne even put one of my yard signs in his yard that first campaign go around. As time went on, I could see what they were doing, manipulating scores and using that as a hammer versus a tool to get people or show the merits of the way they were thinking. I continued to support them because I liked their analysis. They did a more thorough analysis. They only analyze about 60% of the bills that come across. It's not the 100% that a lot of people think. In fact, some of the real defining bills, right to life is a defining position in the Republican Party. They don't rate any of those bills. They just rate bills that are nuanced and pushing their agenda. So that's kind of where that started. Campaigning is not my strength, nor is it something that I quite honestly enjoy doing. Up until the 2022 campaign, I was running for my fourth term. I had never asked a single person for a single dollar to support my campaign. I've raised millions of dollars for other organizations, so I know how to ask for money, but asking for money for myself is a whole different animal than asking for somebody else in a cause. People gave me campaign contributions, but I never asked for one. I never had a single campaign fundraising event up until 2022. Into the 2022 campaign, I could see what it was going to take. I was going to have to spend more money than I ever had. I said, if I'm serious, I'm going to have to get over myself and start asking for money. And I did start asking, and people responded. But by the time I engaged, there had been too much, the old Mark Twain saying, and a lie is halfway around the world before the truth even gets its shoes on. And I think that was true in my campaign. These lies had gotten out there. Number one, I didn't have time to address them any more so than I did in February. The session went into April that year. So there was very little time for campaigning. I wasn't well versed at it, hadn't built the type of campaign team that are needed to go up against this kind of stuff, and just didn't realize and understand the type of campaign I would need to run to fend off these lies.
On that note, just looking through some of these past messaging from your opponent at the time, who ended up winning, which is now Senator Brian Lenny, I'm just looking through some of these tweets, and he's accusing you of legalizing pot because someone said that you had a libertarian standpoint of, that you push for individual liberty and personal freedom for everyone, not just those you agree with, of your idea of morality, that you weren't interested in legislating morality. Of course, Brian Lenny being aligned with Christian nationalism, that makes sense for him. And I look at that, I think, well, that's kind of interesting considering that race, a lot of outside money came in, and a group called Young Americans for Liberty, which is now well known to be a pro-marijuana group, backed him. Here he is criticizing you for something that you didn't even have a position on. And this just kind of goes to this idea of what I saw happening is this playbook called confrontational politics. And it seems like you experienced it in real time during that first campaign. From what it sounds like, you were blindsided. So what was your takeaway from that first race? What did you learn?
I learned, and it was a little surprising, I guess, to me. And there was actually 2 or 3 other senators that were targeted in a similar manner to what I was, and they all actually served on JFAC as well. There's kind of a common thread there. We were all being hit with the dirty, ugly side of Idaho politics. All 3 of us were lifelong Idahoans involved in our communities and not politicians by nature, but pragmatic people. I believe we were doing some good things, not necessarily together. Some of it was together, some of it was separate. We served on different committees apart from each other, so it wasn't like we were this big force, but we were experiencing kind of the same thing. And before I realized that 2/3 of my community didn't even know who I was or had never heard the name, I thought, how can people believe this about me? I mean, again, I've probably come across them everything that I've been involved in for decades. And in fact, I underestimated Freedom Foundation and put out a few outrageous claims. But I said, well, now they've done it. They've undone everything. If people were believing them, they would never believe that. And I was wrong. On top of that, redistricting creates a lot of different dynamics, and I'm not a political pundit or certainly a political historian. I've learned a lot about our political history from an interest standpoint in the last handful of years. We had redistricting, so new people that I'd not been on their ballots before, they may or may not have known me. One of our problems in Canyon County, and specifically in District 13, is we don't get voter turnout. And with the closed primaries, less than 15% of the legal age voters showed up to cast their vote. If I went to the legislature and said, I'm going to try to pass a bill that says only 15 out of 100 votes count, how far would that go? It would go nowhere. They'd throw me out probably for doing something like that. But in fact, that's what we are doing to ourselves. And who are the people that are voting who is that 15%? Well, they're a motivated voter, and they're motivated emotionally. Many of them are here not because they necessarily wanted to be here, because they didn't want to leave a place that they'd lived their entire lives. Maybe they had ancestors that lived there, but they thought they were, felt that they were forced out. And maybe they were forced out. Ultimately drew the line to politics. It might have been economics at the end of the day. It might have been a lot of different things, but can all be drawn back to politics and the actions that were taken in through the pandemic in their respective states and communities. So they're not happy people to begin with when they got here. They didn't get here and see this big panacea and I finally made it, and now I can just sit back and relax and enjoy what I've moved to. No, they driven by fear and driven by these messages, put them on defense. Now you've moved from someplace. Now you have to protect the new place you're in because these guys are going right down that same sewage drain that your other community went down. With no perspective of history, no perspective of why we are where we are, how we got here, and that we're this untouched virgin territory that has just, fallen off of somewhere and landed here in Idaho. So it's, when you throw all those things together, and we're still fighting a lot of those things here 4 or 5 years later, the people in Idaho on average are non-confrontational. We'll step up and fight when we need to, but we're not running around picking fights. The behavior of many of the folks that haven't been here that long is much different than that. Now, I don't know if that's a learned behavior from where they came from or if they've decided that that's what they need to do to keep us from going down that sewer drain that they feel we would be going down otherwise. But they are very, I question, do they even have a conscience when they say some of the stuff that they know are blatant lies? Again, we all have warts. I mean, why don't you pick on the warts? And it's harder for me to defend something that I actually did versus something I didn't do. But then you get to, we're non-confrontational, but then we're hard to make believers too. When we hear something that we think is outrageous. Once our emotions settle down, we don't believe it. And what I'm saying is, I think the fear of public speaking has been transplanted with a bigger fear than that. And that is the fear I didn't know. You mean this has been going on right under my nose for this long and I didn't know about it and everybody else around me knew about it? So we hear these outlandish things and we jump to the conclusion that in fact, yes, that has been going on and I didn't know. And I'm so distraught that I didn't know. So we better do something about it. And when somebody tries to dispute that or talk common sense into you, you've already gone so far down the road that you're not going to believe that.
There was this narrative I kept seeing happen of baseline idea that Idaho is turning blue. They're trying to turn Idaho blue. They're turning Idaho left. And that all these new people moving in from California, they're bringing their leftist values with them and turning it blue. And that narrative was really lean into the new people moving here, of which 70% of them were identified and registered as Republicans. So it wasn't leftists moving from California to Idaho mostly. It was by a vast majority of them were Republicans or affiliated as Republicans or considered themselves conservatives moving to Idaho because they wanted a more conservative place. But Idaho was already conservative and it had been that way, to your point, because of all the groundwork you and others had done over the years, going back 20, 30 plus years. And so then suddenly they want to change it because they're afraid. This fear-based narrative of, they're turning it blue, which was a lie. The data proves that was 100% a lie, but it was believable. And then the next lie on that was, well, Jeff Agenbroad, well, he's a rhino, right? He's helping turn it blue because he's really a Democrat in disguise. That's the next layer of the lie. Paint the enemy being the left. They're trying to take over. They're trying to do this. And the people who are already here, who are already the Republicans, no. How do you make them the bad guy, right? To your point, you lied.
Well, and Greg, one of the things that was being said about me and some others, it wasn't just unique to me, is he's always voting with the Democrats. If you know anything about Idaho and Idaho politics, when a bill gets to the floor, it's not generally a Democratic bill. It's not driven by the Democrats. It's actually they're voting on Republican bills. Those are Republican originated. Democrat bills typically don't make it to the Senate floor or the House, or probably the House floor even. I can't speak as much for the House. So, but they've switched this. Is just look at the record. The Democrats voted this way and Jeff and all the Republicans voted this way too. Well, I wonder why.
Well, you bring up a really good point. If you think about former legislator, now current president of the IFF, or Idaho Freedom Foundation, Ron Nate, looking back at his voting record, he often voted more with Paulette Jordan, who is as left as you get, than members of his own party. In fact, many of the what you would call conservative, or what they call themselves conservative legislators, often voted with the left against Republicans because they were mad. They were being obstructionists. They're flipping that script on its head. It's pure projection. They voted with Democrats, but they don't want to tell you that. Jeff, I'm sure you might know this, or if you're surprised to learn this, but Confrontational Politics is actually a book. And these people where you said that you didn't know where they came from, how did they learn this behavior? But this is actually a book and a class that is taught as part of political activism.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I have actually at a couple of different times looked for the book. It's not as easy to find as I thought it would be. I prefer audiobooks today because I can multitask. The last time I checked, it wasn't in the audiobook catalog. Nonetheless, I do think the people that are employing this come from a different place. They come from a different moral place. They come from a different behavioral place. And whether they're naturally more confrontational or just executing the tactics of the book, it's largely not people from this area that are employing it. Now, I'm not saying it's exclusive to the people that have moved in, but it's really probably driven is the best word I can use, driven from others. And maybe it's because they had experience in other places with this and they're bringing their experience with that to Idaho.
Well, you mentioned before about defining conservatism, and I've talked to a number of people like asking the question, what does it mean? What is conservatism? What does it mean? And the baseline answer I keep getting is it means to conserve, to prevent change, to bring things back to where they were, or to keep things from going past where they were. So it's really about slowing things down, not rapid change. And yet those who call themselves conservatives are doing the opposite. They want change. They want radical change. They want to break things up, cut things down, or in this case of last year, add $50 million to the budget so they can get a narrative piece they want. And so at this point, it's like, what does it even mean to be conservative? Because those who claim to be not following the principles of conservatism at all, we see. And, in this case, you ran against an individual who professed to be a conservative, but at the end of the day, when you look at what they're actually doing, not so much. Now there's a big split between these groups as to saying who's more conservative or not, and turning on each other and saying horrible things about each other, because that's just what happens when people who are focused on, telling lies as a natural course of business for them. Why wouldn't they do that to others who are in power now? Looking at your example and what happened in your races in Nampa, we saw a lot of shift in Canyon County. New groups starting up. I think there was an individual who had a group called Stop Idaho RINOs, which the whole premise is, oh, you're a rhino. I've called you a rhino because I just moved here from California and I decided you are, so I'm going to put you on a website and call you that. Therefore, that label is going to stick, right? And that was the point of this group. And them working with the Freedom Foundation, IAPAC, and then Young Americans for Liberty, and then later on Citizens Alliance of Idaho, all feel like they're part of one big political machine, a machine designed to take out those who have been picked to be targeted for a primary. In this case, they picked you because you were on JFAC or head of JFAC, and they wanted to make changes in budget stuff. They wanted to get what they wanted in. So you go after the people who are making the decisions. You want to change the leadership. They did that to Winder and others, right? When they didn't get what they wanted, replace the person. And at the end of the day, it comes down to who's showing up to vote. You said that they are the most active, the most engaged, the most emotional voters. I've noticed it seems year over year, when these tactics are employed, the number of voters goes down. And I believe, just in my opinion, as people use confrontational tactics, like going door to door, lying about their opponent or saying these horrible things, either the individual at the door gets angry and emotional about it, like you said, that fear of missing out, that FOMO of, oh, I didn't know I was being had this whole time. How did I not see that this person was lying to me? Believing what's being told to them, which the things that are being told are not true, but they don't know that. Or they suspect something's off with what's being told, or they know you and they know that the person is lying to them. But these confrontational tactics are such a turnoff. They're ingrained with this idea that I need to avoid confrontation. I need to avoid contention. So therefore, I'm just going to disengage. This tactic seems to have the effect of either building up a small percentage of people, just enough, I think the target number is around 3%, of the voters to be angry, because the rest of the percentage of voters have already made up their mind. It's that 3% margin to get them angry enough to go out and vote. And the rest, you just want to get them so angry or afraid of the contention that they literally sit home and don't vote.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. You can call it maybe bullying them away. A very small percentage of our society, I've figured out, is more than a casual observer of politics, even though it affects every single one of us. I wish we as a whole were more engaged. I've developed this attitude actually after I really got engaged in politics, that I should have been further engaged than I was. And I thought I was further engaged than I was. How do you know what you don't know? I think there's a lot of truth to that. They're bullying the people away. They're trying to create an environment of a low information voter, more so than we have. We do not have a statewide voter guide. Why is that? Well, the party's against it because they want to feed the people the information that they want them to know and nothing more than that. We don't have a presidential primary any longer. Why is that? Well, it creates a barrier for voting for people and a confusion. And I truly believe that moving to the presidential caucus has negatively impacted our voter turnout in the shortly thereafter primary because people are confused. Well, I thought we just voted. I was just done at the caucus. Aren't we done with that? Or I've already voted. I don't need to vote again. Creating an environment that is easier to control because you're disenfranchising a higher percentage of the people. And that gets back to I ran in 2022 as an incumbent, and then I ran again in 24. And the voter turnout was dismal in 2022, but it was even worse in 2024. And that was the first year of our presidential caucus. In Cannon County, I understand this happens in other counties around the state. The other thing that has been done by the same group is they have weaponized the party. We have, in too many cases, a blind allegiance to our party. I've always been, even before I got into office, a people first, party second guy. I can't think of a time that I voted outside of the Republican ticket, but I certainly, if there was somebody that was a better candidate than another, I would vote for the candidate. I think that's the way a lot of people think, but when they don't have information, we all default back to the party. And when we think of the party, we think of the historic party. I look at the people that are in office in the party offices in Cannon County today. And these are people that had nothing to do with the party 4 or 5 years ago. In fact, in Cannon County, we had a Lincoln Day, and this was in probably 21, maybe 22. I'd have to go back and look. And the group that has offices within the party today were out front picketing. They were not participating in the Lincoln Day. They were picketing a cause that was different in the Republican Party. But they've been able to fool enough people, and you don't have to fool a lot of people when you only have maybe 200 votes in precinct chair races to become in power. Then they start vetting candidates. I'm not against a closed primary. I would prefer not to have a closed primary, but I understand it. I do feel that if we're going to have a closed primary, the Republicans should pay for that instead of all the taxpayers. But in Cannon County, Republicans are only 61% of the people. So you're shutting out a large part of the population because, as we know, there's really only one election in Idaho because we are so Republican strong. That's the primary. The general public doesn't understand that because that is not a message that's being put out. We've got a party that was also campaigning against me. And I didn't realize this in 22, and it became very clear in 2024. Even though I signed the Republican pledge with a few exceptions, both times that I ran that I was asked to do so, and I never violated my pledge to the Republican Party, nor did anybody suggest that I violated that pledge. They vetted me, and my opponent actually did, in not a nuanced way, but a blatant way, more than once. The party, which was represented by just a handful of selected people, chose to endorse my opponent. I don't think that there's any room for the party to be involved in a primary to put their thumb on the scales. I think that's up to the people. You let the candidates talk to the people, the voters. Don't put your thumb on the scale. But not only did they endorse my opponent, but they refused to put my literature in any of the drop bags at the doors. So they were taking the vote and the information away from the people. I don't think that's who the Republican Party is. And that is also a significant influence that's happening to our populace that I hope we can correct sooner rather than later.
You bring up a really good point about the party issue. That was part of this plan, this takeover. In order for one minority group to take power, they have to first take over the party while trying to take these seats, right? So by utilizing these confrontational tactics, if you're a unpaid volunteer precinct committee officer who most people don't even know who represents them at the PCO level, let alone what the job entails. Part of it is, to your point, going out and handing out literature, informing voters about the party, bringing new people to what should be the bigger tent of the Republican Party, not shrinking it. And instead, they used it to drive the people who were already there out. If you're nasty, if you're lying about something, you're spreading rumors, that individual is going to want to leave. Like, I'm not getting paid to do this. I don't want to be a part of this anymore, and I don't like the ickiness. And so they leave. And that creates a vacancy that gets handpicked by these new people taking over. They get to handpick someone to replace them and fill that vacancy. And they just do it over and over again until they've taken enough of the votes to control the local county central committee. And when you control the local county central committee, who's going to hold you accountable to your own bylaws and rules, right? And it had been, that was the whole thing for as long as I can remember, that the Republican Party, the central committees, the state central committee, do not weigh in a primary. And yet here they are doing it. You see this in North Idaho and other places where they're putting out photo guides of rated and vetted candidates who are basically the people they've approved and are okay with running because they've kissed the ring, or by omission, by not handing out the literature so the voter doesn't know who the opponent is and they only see the one name, then leaning more into the voter apathy and lack of voter information. Informing voters who's actually running and telling the truth of them is their kryptonite. Hence why they didn't want a presidential primary. In a presidential primary year, if the presidential primary had been held at the same time as the May primaries, as they had been voted to do so, which, one will argue she didn't, but she did get up and testify against it and ask the committee chair to kill that so they could do a caucus. They intentionally made it so people wouldn't show up to vote because they didn't want to vote twice. And the whole caucus thing was a disaster. Their idea of election security was plastic bins from Costco. It was hilarious at how haphazardly that was thrown together. The intent there, from what I saw, was they knew that if you had merged the presidential primary with everyone wanting to come out and vote for Trump, which they did, 70% or more, voted for Trump, but that would have brought more voters in. And anytime you have more voters, they lose because they can't lie to enough people.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's even, becomes more dangerous because in Idaho, by statute, we have some nonpartisan parties. Nonpartisan races. The parties, by design are not supposed to weigh into because these are more your local positions that are pragmatic jobs, not necessarily setting policy, but certainly running cities and counties and so forth. And that's, to me, we're going to lose the party when voters wake up and see that they've been duped. And even as far as weighing in, we as individually or as groups outside of the parties have every right to weigh into any measure, partisan or nonpartisan, we would like to. But I feel that there is no place for a party, and I don't care whether it's Republican, Democrat, or any other, to weigh into nonpartisan races. That's an abuse of a good name that's been built over the years by a lot of people, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. What's happening through weighing into these nonpartisan races is ultimately undermining our party. And I hate to see that. I still believe in the party. I don't like a lot of things that are happening in the Idaho party today and the tactics they're using, but I do still believe in the foundation of the party.
So your approach to doing things appeared to be more of communicating better with people, focusing on coming to a consensus or disagreeing better, right? Just coming up with a more civil approach to things. And yet by doing that, you were attacked heavily and in some way, as you said, blindsided initially because you weren't used to seeing this level of animosity and contention. In your experience, what would you recommend to somebody who is thinking about or actively working towards running a new campaign for this next session with this kind of opposition, with this political machine fighting against them? What would you tell them?
Well, I think you certainly have to assess your environment. Every district environment is not the same in Idaho. Assess your environment and get a good lay of the land. Also understand the influencers in that arena. We'll talk about District 13, which is the district I'm in. Understand who the influencers and what what groups are the influencers? Ironically, most of the influence in District 13 and most districts around the state, the influence wasn't from within. The influence came from outside the district, in many cases outside the state, but it was absorbed because there was not a lot of other just even information available in the district. So it's an education campaign. So work with those that can help educate the public. It might be education that actually hurts a person's campaign platform that's considering running, but educate the facts, level set the facts as best you can in the community, try to counteract the bullying. Some people say, well, you have to fight fire with fire. If they're going to bully, you got to bully. I think the people that we want in office representing us, and this is just my opinion, aren't bullies by nature. They're willing to fight for something that they believe in, or that they believe in on behalf of their constituents. They're not bullies. And I think the other thing that has to happen is the truth needs to be told. If you have an opponent that is not driven by the constituents, they'll tell you they are, because none of them will tell you they aren't. But when you look at what they've done, particularly if they're an incumbent, you can see that what they're supporting is not representative of the citizens' sentiment who they claim to be representing. So when they show you who they are, believe them. And that has to be pointed out to the public. And it has to be very blatant and repeated. So it really is largely an information campaign. It can't just all be coming from the candidate. It's got to be broader than that. Unfortunately, a good place for that information to get out, the right place for that information to get out is the party. But in Canyon County, and specifically District 13, we cannot rely on that today. In fact, it's the opposite of that. And I think you have to really point out the candidates that fall into this. Draw the lines to whose ideas they're following. Are they independent thinkers? Are they independent thinkers enough that they will listen to the constituents and weigh the pros and cons? And there's a number of votes that I took while I was in office. Excuse me. There's a number of votes that I took while I was in office that if it were just left up to me, I may have voted the other way. But I had enough constituent feedback that I said, who am I here to represent? Am I representing Jeff, or am I representing my community? Every one of those situations, I defaulted to the community. And I think that that's the way that it should be. I wish I had a magic wand that if somebody were considering running, I could say, do this, this, and this, and you got it. Unfortunately, it's just not that simple. And I think they changed their tactics a little bit from 2022 to 2024. And I wouldn't doubt if those tactics will again be changed. You have to be prepared for that. It's an uphill battle in today's environment. And it's unfortunate because I think it's just taking advantage of not a stupid voter, not a dumb voter, but just a low information voter, a voter that doesn't have enough motivation because maybe things haven't hit them square in the face. They don't have enough motivation to find the information, even if they think it's not out there, to really educate themselves. We have to get it out there. We have to get it known and available. I think the ultimate answer to solving our problem is voter turnout in the primary. We know how to do it. Look at our general elections. We get good turnout. We just don't get it in the primaries. I strongly believe that is simply not enough available information for people to take a position and get out to vote. We don't have 24/7 cable news channels talking about state politics or even local politics. So many people, we really don't have one source of information anymore, with people stopping watching their local news and not watching or not subscribing to their papers. So it's all certainly bifurcated and falls back on social media, which we all know is full of both the truth and lies and everything in between.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate your insight. I appreciate your experience in this realm and how You've been in the trenches. You served for many terms. You've fought the good fight and dealt with this firsthand. I think it's a good lesson for anyone looking to better understand what's going on. But you're right. Voters need to understand there is a primary election in May. It is the most important election in Idaho when it comes to legislation and who's going to be governor and everything else. With the majority of voters being Republican, that means that the Republican primary, whoever wins that, is most likely going to win the general. Very rarely does that ever flip. It's very rare. And this year, I think we do see some interesting things happening. We're seeing some independents run, which we hadn't seen before at a higher level. And that's going to be telling to see how well that turns out. But I appreciate your time. Appreciate you coming on the show and answering these. I know these aren't easy questions. I'm sure we'll talk some more and look forward to everything you're working on.
Well, Greg, I appreciate you inviting me to the program, and I appreciate what you're doing. It's not easy. It takes courage because you're the subject of attack, but it's a voice that needs to be out there for people to consume. And every opportunity that I have when I'm before a group talking about local, we'll just call them issues, not even necessarily local politics, that want to know what's going on around the state and the region, I refer them directly to political potatoes. And it's and you keep it entertaining as well. It's now and then you have to smile, and you do that, but you do a phenomenal job of putting facts out there. Certainly, there's opinions in there as well, but I think those are clearly defined. I thank you for what you're doing, and as much as anything, I'm sure that I will get some feedback from my conversation today. Some of it, I think most of it will be good, but there'll be others that are going to attack and bully me because that's what they choose to do. But I'll welcome that because I appreciate what you're doing. Any way I can contribute to help get that information out, I want to do so.
Thank you, Jeff.